Dusk folds over the Florida coast like a dark chart, and the Atlantic stretches outward in a muted breath, where color drains and instruments grow important. And it is here that a routine winter training flight left the runway and slipped into folklore, becoming the case by which the ocean learned to keep a secret a little too well. It was December of 1945, the war over, but its habits still alive, and at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale 5 Grumman TBM, Avengers warmed their engines for a standard exercise that cadets knew by number more than by name, a navigation problem meant to teach. Wayfinding in a world that turns slowly while wind and water insist on their own agendas. The plan was simple. Fly east to a shallow reef marked on the training charts, practice drops, then swing north and west to come home, tracing a triangle whose corners were familiar, even to students who had only just met the sea, a geometry of headings and time that left little to the imagination, unless the sky decided otherwise. Their instructor, a combat veteran newly reassigned to Florida, climbed into the lead aircraft with the gravity of someone used to noise and consequence, guiding a formation of trainees whose job was to fly tight, listen sharply, and trust the math. And in that, discipline was comfort, because the ocean was not yet a character in the story, only a backdrop with a long horizon. Out over the Bahamas light, the water traded slate for turquoise, and the reef lay beneath them like a pale signature, and training became choreography, and hours became degrees, and minutes became miles, the kind of arithmetic that makes a cockpit feel like a desk with wings, and then the first thread of unease slipped in so quietly you might miss it. For reasons reconstructed from radio traffic and later testimony, the lead pilot began to doubt his position, noticing islands that did not match his expectations and compasses that did not seem to help, and the firm grid of bearings frayed into choices, with east competing with west, and the sun sliding lower in a way that does not care about humans holding naps. Beyond their wings, the Gulf Stream ran like a conveyor belt, moving water north faster than intuition allows, and pushing drift where dead reckoning would prefer certainty. And as weather thickened and low cloud and rain squalls touched the surface in stippled curtains, the tidy triangle on paper became a living corridor where error grows legs. Airwaves filled with attempts to reconcile map and sea, instructors on the ground trying to stitch radial bearings from distant stations into something actionable, aircraft aloft comparing notes they were not sure they could trust, and all the while fuel burned at a rate that ignored arguments, ticking away toward choices that narrow from many to few. The legend that would become the Bermuda Triangle did not yet exist, but the elements that fed it were assembling. Compasses, apparently, misbehaving distances that stretch in the mind as light fades squall lines that look like fences, and finally, the awareness that daylight is not a neutral witness and that the sea at night is a hive of identical motions. A search would be ordered, as doctrine and decency demand, and even this act would be pulled into the mystery's zavity when one of the rescue planes vanished as well, the web tightening around a date that would thrum for decades as listeners argued about whether ordinary misfortune had been misread as omen, or whether omen had adopted the mask of misfortune. There are photographs from that era showing Avengers nose-high on approach, their stout wings and heavy frames made for punishment, their cockpits smelling of oil, aluminum, and old flight jackets, and imagining those aircraft settling toward a restless ocean with fuel needles. Thinning asks us to hold still in the presence of a story that does not resolve quickly. When the last transmissions thinned and died, somewhere in the Atlantic dark, the world above the waves returned to its rituals of search patterns and logbooks. But below, the continental shelf tipped downward into deeper water, sand shifting slowly over new shapes, and the idea that 5 aircraft could vanish without a trace began to unnerve even those who know what the sea can do. The air grew quieter on the base that night, and the first drafts of reports began to turn uncertainty into sentences, while elsewhere myth set its scaffolding the patient decisiveness of folklore, and in the gap between the two, a question took a long breath that would last generations. The Avengers themselves were sturdy creatures, torpedo bombers, repurposed for training at war's end, their radial engines steady as heartbeats, and their navigation kits reliable in the hands of pilots who respected the limits of magnetism and math. Deliberate design whose predictability was another reason December 5th did not announce itself as anything but an ordinary day. The exercise, plotted on a chart like a child's drawing, started with a line due east to a shoal, so shallow it changed the color of water, a turn north for a fixed distance, then a homeward leg west toward the Florida coast. The entire loop calibrated for daylight margins and fuel reserves generous enough to accommodate mild confusion, a prudence that assumed cooperation from weather and light. Radio practice was part of the training too, with frequencies for instruction and emergencies. Homing signals from coastal stations meant to become beacons if a flight fell into doubt, and a discipline of silence and response that keeps airways clear when the sky grows crowded, all of which make the tangled minutes of the afternoon feel like a slow unbraiding. Somewhere after the bombing run, the instructor became convinced the formation had wandered farther east than intended, possibly beyond the Bahamas rather than west of them. A conviction that flips all compass roses upside down, because once you decide that the coast lies elsewhere, every corrective move pulls you deeper into error, especially when cloud banks blur the handwriting of the horizon. Magnetic variation, the quiet skew between true and magnetic north, was another of the ocean's private jokes, a variable across latitude and longitude that demands pilots pay attention. And in 1945, the Agonic Line, the place where that skew disappears, ran near the western Atlantic in a way that could render a familiar correction suddenly unfamiliar, a subtlety that can confuse even steady minds late in the day. Winds at altitude speak a language that can seem polite until they are not, and an unexpected push from the northwest would send ground tracks south and east, while headings dutifully hold their numbers, a silent interview between air and wing that a pilot might not notice until islands appear where they do not belong, or fail to appear where they should have been waiting. As daylight drained, ground stations tried to compile bearings from whatever signals they could catch. Lines on a map intersecting in seas that some argued were further east than the pilots believed. A geometry that suggested the flight was wandering toward the open Atlantic rather than toward the Gulf, while the shouters inside the radios did their best to keep each other inside hearing. The decision to send a rescue aircraft was immediate and ordinary, and the PBM Mariner that climbed into the falling night carried a reputation as a flying gas tank roomy and capable, with a history of fuel vapor mishaps that crews managed with vigilance and luck, a combination insufficient against the possibility of a spark over rough water and low visibility near the Florida coast. Witnesses aboard a ship off the coast reported a sky-bright flash and a smell that travels farther than flames, and the rescue plane's own absence fused itself to the story, enlarging the shadow that Flight 19 would cast, because one disappearance is a tragedy, and two become a pattern the mind wants to name, especially when seas grow choppy and rain taps out privacy on aluminum skins. That night turned into records, transcripts of partial transmissions, fuel estimates scribbled across margins, bearings written with the calm of professionals trying to stitch a net. And in the morning, those records turned into a board of inquiry whose conclusions held uncertainty close, as if naming a cause without proof would be a second kind of mistake they refused to make in public. Years later, as magazines learned how to sell amazement, and books learned how to amplify rumor into genre, the phrase Bermuda Triangle acquired its capital letters, and Flight 19 became one of its pillars. A case that bore weight, because the official story had holes that could be filled with magnetism gone wild, portals and time slips, underwater cities, or silent experiments with radio waves. Beneath the showmanship lay the ocean as stubborn facts, currents that scatter debris away from likely search lanes, winter seas that roughen to lethal in hours, air temperatures that chill a pilot in the water far faster than any rescue grid can respond, and a seafloor that shifts under soft sand, swallowing metal and story with equal appetite just beyond the continental shelf. Decades of searches, some official and some private, returned with wings and engines and fuselages that proved to be other Avengers lost during training. Their serial numbers and histories, reluctant to match the missing 5, a pattern that turned hope into a more complex feeling because each find proved the C's capacity to hide and also its habit of giving back the wrong answers. Archives continued to yield paper instead of metal, teletype logs from the base, notes from Miami and Nassau stations, later analyses that showed what might have happened had different frequencies been used, had homing requests been accepted, had cloud holes opened sooner, and each document felt like a flashlight beam too narrow and too late, asking the reader to imagine decisions under noise. The last hours of radio across those waters carry a quiet that stretches time, and whether the formation held together until the end or broke apart under cloud remains one of those details that refuses to reveal itself, as if the ocean insisted on preserving the integrity of the story by keeping its most intimate choice concealed. To sit with the maps and reconstruct the afternoon is to move slowly, treating each vector like a reed in a current, a practice better suited to candlelight than to drama. And yet, in the patient addition of wind, drift, and human caution, a portrait forms that feels both ordinary and awful, a sequence that ends with the horizon coming upward on dark water. Departure times, recorded with the tidy confidence of a functioning base, place wheels up early in the afternoon, with a clean leg east to the shoals. Practice drops completed, while the sun still held firm above the wing, and a turn that should have led them north toward open water for a measured distance before a homeward heading back into a coastline that knows how to announce itself. If a wind from the northwest undercut the dead reckoning, the northward leg would be longer than the stopwatch says, and the east-west correction would drift southward without anyone's consent, placing the formation among islands whose shapes rhyme with each other when the light is wrong, and among banks where the color of the sea plays tricks on the eye. A pilot accustomed to another coastline might mistake one chain of islands for another, and once that thought lands, it refuses to move because every shoreline is a mirror that feeds an image of certainty back to the brain that wants it, and radio bearings that contradict it feel like noise unless trust is given freely and early, a gift few give easily when the fuel clock is running down. Ground stations pleaded with geometry, plotting lines of position from what they could hear their intersection areas drifting east of the Florida Peninsula into the Atlantic proper, an analysis that suggests the formation may have been far from the Gulf the instructor hoped to see, and far enough that a western leg would lead them toward nothing like a coast in the available daylight. If the lead ship as radio struggled to hear the homing signals, or if antenna problems kept the navigation beacon from being useful, the homing option would vanish precisely when most needed, leaving hope invested in sighting land that did not wish to appear on schedule, and by the time the sun surrendered, few levers would remain to pull inside those 5 cockpits. In other reconstructions, the formation begins to break up as fuel levels fall unevenly, with some aircraft ordered to splinter and head off, and with others remaining in a group whose integrity had been its strength, but now becomes a kind of shared fate, with waves rising enough to make the idea of ditching all 5 safely feel like a test the ocean rarely allows to be passed. The Avengers were heavy-nosed machines. A low-speed, water-level touchdown risked a forward pitch that could flip the aircraft in seconds, and at night in a winter sea, even a good ditching could turn into a fatal struggle, with rafts hard to deploy and flares useless in rain, and with the Gulf Stream standing by to erase coordinates by morning in a language all its own. Search grids launched at first light did what search grids do, sweeping pattern upon pattern across a sea, textured by whitecaps and hope, while Coast Guard cutters and Navy vessels stood into waters where the shelf falls away into darkness after a narrow ledge, hunting for oil slicks or fabric or the straight lines that metal makes against geology when the sun plays fair. Time produced its own finds scattered across decades. An Avenger pulled from the shallows that belonged to another training loss. A cluster of Avengers discovered on the seabed whose serial numbers told stories of accidents, unrelated to the missing five, and each discovery felt both like a step toward closure and a reminder that the sea keeps shelves of history without labels. Sonar maps of the seafloor show dunes that move under the push of current, sculpted sand capable of hiding a fuselage on Monday and letting a wingtip peek out on Friday, while beyond the shelf, the slope steepens into a relief that is dangerous for small subs and easy to lose your place in. And it is there that some investigators suspect the five found their last altitude. Modern expeditions with side-scan sonar and magnetometers revisit the search area like careful archaeologists tasked with sweeping a continent, tracing long transects over deep black and logging every anomaly. Each blip a candidate for truth that rarely survives the second pass, teaching patience to teams that arrived already patient, and preserving the possibility that a cluster of Avengers might still sleep together. What remains gripping is the overall quietness of the end, the absence of debris washing ashore, the lack of life raft sightings from ships that would have reported, the way the sea became an accomplice to the disappearance rather than a stage for it. And this quietness keeps inviting questions about choice and chance that no wreckage has yet had the opportunity to answer. Night returns in any reconstruction, the kind of dark that flattens the ocean into a sound rather than a surface. And somewhere in that sound, five engines likely gave their last work to gravity and water. A moment as mundane as it is profound, because almost every mystery that endures does so by being smaller and more ordinary than the theories that would dress it otherwise. Between the careful pages of inquiry and the looser chapters of myth, a penumbra of possibilities persists, because even a well-behaved map has smudges where the mind can write, and Flight 19 found them all creating an intersection where science and story agreed to meet without promising to agree with each other. Electromagnetism is often called to the witness stand, with compasses presented as victims of a regional anomaly. And although the Atlantic's variation is indeed a shifting personality, the instruments were not known to simply spin without cause, which is why some prefer subtler hypotheses, like mistaken corrections near the agonic line or compass deviation in one airframe spreading mistrust to the group by reputation alone. Other accounts drift into the military's own shadows, suggesting misset frequencies, crowded bands, and crossed instructions that, in the moment, produced more heat than light, or a failure of a homing system that should have been routine. And here the conspiracy fades into bureaucratic entropy, a less glamorous culprit that nevertheless explains a great deal when hours are short. Older theories step forward with straight backs, uncharted atmospheric lenses bending radio paths into nonsense, magnetic storms threading field lines through cockpit instruments in ways rare and localized, time slips and spatial eddies gathered under names as dramatic as the emotions that birthed them, stories that ask to be true while quietly declining to offer a test you can perform twice. Meanwhile, the search plane's vanishing keeps a second candle lit, yet the prosaic explanation holds. A mariner heavy with fuel vapor, a humid night, and an ignition source becoming a brief sunrise over the coastal shelf, a loss compounded by the timing that married it to the other disappearance in the mind of the public, solidifying a pattern that might otherwise have dissipated by morning. Pilots who flew that coast speak about mirage and shadow, about rain curtains that turn land into rumor, about seas that erase wreckage with a competence that feels personal, and their testimony, collected over years, layers ordinary hazard upon ordinary hazard until the culmination reads like fate, a cumulative story that rarely earns headlines until it is gathered under a more marketable name. But if you zoom out from the single day, the region has hosted other vanishings that drape like flags over the Seine Yard. A British airliner that faded in 1948, another in 1949, a DC-3 with awkward electrics, and bad weather that never found its runway. And each case carries its own signature that resists being folded neatly into a single pattern even though the temptation persists. Debunkers, those useful caretakers of attention, remind us that traffic density matters, that a busy corridor will naturally acquire more incidents, and that many celebrated mysteries dissolve under the lens of primary documents read without preconception. And yet even they admit that Flight 19's combination of factors remains singular in its stack, which is why the story endures in both campfire and classroom. The Board of Inquiry's language revised and revisited dances between causes and shrugs at one point, leaning toward navigational error, compounded by weather and scarcity of daylight, at another, reverting to cause unknown, as if the officials understood that certainty would satisfy the paperwork, while somehow draining the story of its cautionary power. A small industry of reconstruction has grown in the decades since, with navigators modeling winds, RADI, or historians studying the propagation quirks of winter skies at those frequencies, and divers sweeping grids with the kind of patience the sea respects, each discipline pulling on a thread that sometimes tightens and sometimes slips, reminding us that mystery is a participatory sport. Every so often a headline announces that the missing Avengers have been found, a cluster of aircraft discovered within a reasonable radius of the runway, only to be proven the wrong tail numbers, different accidents with their own ghosts. And while disappointment follows the ocean, quietly keeps the lesson that identification matters more than proximity when you tell stories about closure. Some nights, when maps and numbers are put away, the image that remains is simple: 5 aircraft in a loose formation inside weather that offered few promises, and instructor betting on a coast that lay behind his shoulder, fuel slipping toward its final quarter, and a decision fork where every road leads to a narrower one, until only one choice remains, and even that is not a choice so much as a physics. The idea that their final rest might be together beyond the shelf, where the bottom drops away like a theater seating arrangement, lost in shadow, is both poetic and practical, and it motivates expeditions that still leave quietly from Florida marinas, with gear lashed down and checklists complete, hoping to trade ambiguity for altitude data that a serial number can love. At the boundary between fact and fancy, Flight 19 has taken a seat that it will likely keep, not because the strange is the only explanation, but because the ordinary remains unproven in a way that invites art and analysis alike. And in that invitation is a promise that the next page might offer a clearer map if only the right light is found. Technology leans back toward the water with a new patience now. Side scan arrays humming along the shelf edge, autonomous vehicles tracing transects across coordinates that live in logbooks older than their operators. And each quiet mission adds pixels to a seafloor that once was just a rumor with depth soundings, creating a portrait whose resolution grows as literature and oceanography learn each other's vowels. Salvage teams have hauled up enough history from the Florida seabed to furnish a museum's as worth of testimony. Engines encrusted into coral-like sculptures, wings that still hold their rivet patterns with pride, and data plates that anchor narratives to dates with the finality that paper never quite earns. And yet the 5 that matter most to this story continue to decline the invitation to rise. Boards and archives produce new marginalia from time to time. A scrap of teletype here, a memo tucked into an envelope there. And when historians return to these artifacts with fresh eyes, they find tiny hinge points that could have turned the day. A clearer exchange on frequency, a firmer faith in triangulated bearings, or a sun that slid a little more slowly toward night. Culturally, the story has migrated into cinema and paperback, into scenes where aircraft reappear under better stars than ours, and into museums where a mannequin in an Avengers cockpit sits in a frozen dusk that you can walk around without getting wet. And whether you favor romance or realism, the draw is the same, an unresolved shape that fits the human love of puzzles without the cruelty of villains. In classrooms that teach navigation, Flight 19 plays a quieter role, a case study in confidence and error, in the necessity of declaring uncertainty early enough to harvest help, in the psychology of leadership under noise, and in the humility required to trust instruments that feel wrong in your bones, lessons that stretch far beyond cockpits into any field where maps must be read in weather. In the broader category, often called triangles, the skeptics continue their patient work, sifting accident reports from mundane causes and context, rounding off the sharp corners that legends sharpen for effect. And yet, in the sifting, they sometimes leave a handful of grains that will not pass through, telling us that the ocean is not obligated to hand us neat stories, even when we ask politely. If a definitive discovery comes, it may arrive as a sonar return that resists dismissal, a clump of shapes whose geometry is unmistakable, followed by dives that extract numbers and names with a gentleness due to graves. And the announcement will likely be subdued because closure, when it finally arrives, demands a softer voice than the headlines with which the mystery fed itself for years. Until then, the sea itself is the archive, moving and deepening, storing with indifference and yielding with whim. And our role is not only to pry, but to listen, which is another way of saying that mystery can be a teacher if we let it be, and that some answers take the time they require and not the time we demand. Standing on a winter beach not far from where the story began, you can hear the Atlantic's long breath and imagine a 5-ship formation somewhere just beyond sight. A belief sustained not by superstition, but by compassion, the kind of imagined companionship we extend to those who never got to turn final toward home. A vigil we keep because it suits the better parts of us. Far offshore, where charts thicken with contour lines and the water darkens into a patient blue, the shelf waits without opinion, and the machines we send across it now fly or swim by echo rather than by horizon. An inversion that feels like progress, only if it delivers what the human heart quietly asks for in every such story, which is presence enough to replace legend with location. In the end, Flight 19 is not only an episode, but a lens focusing questions about trust and error, about how stories are built and how they are used, about the manners of the sea and the modesty of instruments, and about the space we do and do not give to the unknown, a space that, when treated with respect, becomes a kind of rest rather than a source of restless fear. Before you drift into sleep, remember, mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.